Business Matters.
نحمده ونصلي على رسول الكريم أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Just gone 25 minutes past 7. It's Radio Al-Ansar on the Monday evening on the 20th of November. You with me, Anwar Mullah, and it's the Business Matters program. Yes, the Business Matters program brought to you by the Minara Chamber of Commerce. And if it's Monday Matters, and if it's evening on Radio Al-Ansar, then you're certainly on the Business Matters program. Today, I have a guest in the studio with me. And before I introduce him, let me introduce the topic to you. The topic for tonight is the effects of on the economy of during war and conflict. Yes, we all know of the war and conflicts that are taking part in many places of the world, particularly the Ukraine conflict, and now more particularly the one that's very close to all our hearts, the conflict that's taking place in Gaza. And yes, we're going to be discussing the economic impact of these wars and other wars that have taken place in the past on economies. And to do that, I have in the studio with me a very young gentleman called Hamza Goolam Mahomed. Hamza is a forex dealer at Baraka Bank. And I certainly know that I'm getting old when I have my son's class colleague sitting with me in the studio. But Alhamdulillah, it says one thing to me, and as far as Baraka is concerned, is that the bank is in good hands, and young people like Hamza are making great strides at the bank, and inshallah they will be the future of the Baraka Bank going forward. So yeah, Hamza, with that, it's Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the studio.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Jazakallah to yourself and to Minara for arranging the program and for having me on the show.
Hamza, thanks for coming in. I think we're going to have a nice interactive program tonight. It's certainly a very interesting topic and very, very relevant for what we're going through at the moment. Hamza, let's start by saying war and conflict. I mean, certainly all of us think war is unnecessary. And certainly the conflict in Gaza at the moment costing many, many, many lives unnecessarily. Blame can be apportioned to whichever side you want to, but certainly the innocent getting hurt as well. But besides the fact that lives are being lost, which is really the primary concern, we have the economic impacts of whatever is happening in these wars. So can you provide a brief overview of how war and conflict impacts on the economy?
Primarily, like you say, the loss of life is the most significant part of a war. And that as a result, through the death and the displacement of people and populations, we find that workforces diminish. We find that knowledge that lies in a workforce either escapes through refugees coming out of the country that's facing the conflict, and just generally people within the country and the infrastructure that's destroyed through the conflict has a significantly dire impact on the economy that the conflict is taking place in. So war is devastating is the only word to use to describe the effects on an economy of war and conflict.
Absolutely. I mean, as I said, our hearts go out to what's happening out there. But we're focusing on the economic side of the impact that we're having there. And I remember when the Ukraine war started, and I can't remember how long ago it was now, but it's still dragging on. Suddenly we had a spike in, for example, the price of fertilizer, price of sunflower.
Yes.
Those were things that were primarily being produced in that region.
Yeah.
And it has a ripple effect throughout the economy. So, can you kind of explain how the economy becomes intertwined with the dynamics of war and conflict?
Yeah, so, I think for the purposes of this discussion, it's helpful to think of war as just another economically impactful event.
Okay.
Unfortunately, that's, at the end of the day, that's what it boils down to. And like you say,
like drought or anything else.
Like a drought, like a natural disaster, like a ship getting stuck in the Suez Canal.
Right.
These are economically impactful events that have knock-on effects. And with the intertwined nature of our world at the moment and globalization being where it is, any event in any part of the world has an effect on the economy in the rest of the world. And so, like you mentioned, when Russia invaded Ukraine, Ukraine was a primary exporter of grain to a large part of Africa, and that the cost of that meant that many parts of Africa moved from a food secure position to food insecure positions, because those costs had increased. And like that, just about everywhere else in the world, any kind of conflict that has an impact on any type of economic output will impact other areas of the world. And like I say, it's just another economically impactful event.
Okay. Yeah, Hamza, we know you at the trading desk at the Al Baraka Bank, looking at the currencies all day, every day. I've had the good fortune of speaking to you on a few occasions, trying to find out what's the rate. Should I be paying? Should we be holding? What's your thoughts on, is the rate going to go up or down or whatever? I'm sure you're faced with many of those calls all the time.
Yeah.
And you've taken over from the very capable Mr. John Robello, who used to be there for many, many years. Hamza, in terms of currencies, if you want to just talk currencies before talking GDP, employment, inflation, the impact of world currencies of events like these, call it another event, but like an event like a war.
Yeah. So that's largely dependent on what the expected economic impact of that event will be. Unfortunately, when we take a look at something like the war in Gaza at the moment, it's not that economically impactful on the world. We saw an initial reaction to it where certain economists and market analysts thought that the prices of oil might increase, and they did increase for a short while, with the expectation that other countries would become involved in the conflict and the conflict would expand. But now that the conflict sort of settled and it's just a conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis, we've seen that the markets have pretty much settled into where they are now, and focus has shifted back onto your traditional economic measures. I think looking at items such as GDP and employment and inflation, there's two or sometimes three stories here, depending on who the countries involved are. You've got the attacker or the aggressor, and you have somebody like the United States, for example. When countries go into conflict, and we look at the Ukraine war, a huge amount of money has been dumped into that war. But that money that they pledge to that country doesn't go to them in the form of cash. That goes to them in the form of aid, in the form of weapons. And those weapons are then procured from their own manufacturers and their own suppliers. And that drives growth in their own economies. And so you'll see for the aggressing country, or the country that's supporting one side of the war, like a USA, like a United Kingdom or France, where there's a huge defense industry, those countries could have upturns in their GDPs and in their output, economic output, their inflation, their employment demand, as they ramp up production to restock themselves because of what they've provided to the countries in conflict. And then you've got the countries that are at war, or the defending country that's usually being invaded, and they are the ones that bear the brunt of the economic cost of that conflict, because there you'll see the infrastructure destruction, you'll see the drain on their ability to produce power. We've seen Russia bomb a few power stations in Ukraine. They've blocked access to ports in Mariupol, for example, so grain can't leave the country. And those situations then obviously diminish the ability of that country's economy to grow and to sustain itself. And then there's sometimes a third aspect as well, and that is the global impact, like you've mentioned, and like we said, that's dependent on where the countries or the countries that are involved are. You throw a country like Iran into a conflict, for example, and you now end up with a huge impact on the oil prices, because a lot of oil or tankers from the Gulf of the Arabian Gulf can't move out through the Strait of Hormuz, and that would have significant impacts on a number of other measures of economic growth. So we just have to look at it, basically on a geographical scale or a geographical map, to see how far the extent of that conflict would be on the rest of the world.
Yeah, you mentioned the armaments industry, and you mentioned America.
Yeah.
And it's funny how America gets involved where there's a war anywhere in the world, really. I mean, where we would say, mind your own business and keep out of this, but certainly not the case.
No, it isn't.
But it boils down to the fact, I would think, to a large extent, where America is the world's largest producer of arms, as we know, and ammunitions. And that does keep their economy going as well. So, what sometimes they say they're playing two sides of the tabla, where America will be supplying arms to one side and the other side would also be procuring arms, American arms, but through some third party
Yes.
or things like that. So both the parties in a conflict would end up using similar or the same arms, but coming from different sources.
Yep.
But I mean, America, and if you look at Europe as well, have thrown billions or hundreds of billions of dollars at the Ukraine conflict, primarily on the side of Ukraine fighting against Russia, because they view Russia as the enemy. And yet the war seems to be at some sort of a stalemate at the moment. No party really making significant gains on either side. But it obviously helps the American economy, because they need to now produce more arms, more sophisticated arms, to keep their economy going. And also it kind of a wake-up call to other nations that, hey, if this thing could happen in Ukraine, it can happen somewhere else as well.
Yeah.
So you need to be arming yourself to be able to be ready for a conflict. Now, my point I'm driving is, if I take the Middle Eastern countries, I'm going to talk the Arab nations, whether it's Saudi Arabia, UAE, and a host of others there, they procuring hundreds of billions of rands or dollars of American arms. And one would think quite unnecessarily, but they're driving the economy. I mean, isn't it kind of silly to say that the American economy is primarily being driven by the Middle Eastern purchases of these arms, and yet the when push comes to crunch, from a political perspective, America then supports somebody like Israel?
To a large extent, I mean, the Arab nations, I think, if you look at them, are, loosely joined together, or not very loosely, but through the GCC and organizations as such, have, with American backing as well, have joined up forces and in this existential threat that Iran faces or poses towards them.
Sure.
And, that's primarily, I think, what drives their purchases of weaponry and arms from the United States. And there's a loose axis, if you want to call it, amongst Iran, China, Russia, sort of, and then the BRICS nations on the side of that as a third to it, trying to counter the dominance of the West and of the American economy and the American influence that is exercised over global economies. And so, there's sort of this thing of needing to choose between the two sides. Whose side do you want to be on? I think there was a rare show of support and the or not support, but dissent from the Saudis in calling off on their normalization talks with the Israelis when the war in Gaza had started, and joining with the other Arab nations and the Iranians in calling for a ceasefire against America's narrative that they're trying to push, that the Israelis are doing this in self-defense and they've got carte blanche to do what they want to do. And so there's these rare moments where you see these parts of dissent. But I think, like you say, at the end of it, that their support is American as much as what the facade might present out to the world differently. And that's unfortunately a reality, is that a lot of the big American economy companies are driven through arms sales, and wars are healthy for the American economy. It gives them access to new ground, a lot of rebuilding that takes place after conflicts, especially where the Americans are involved, then goes back to an American company or contracted to Americans to then provide security, and it drives that whole economy of the defense economy, and it helps keep it going.
Yeah, I mean, if I take this one step further and we look at the end result of wars and the rebuilding process, as you alluded to, I mean, I've been into Gaza and I was there a few years ago, and the unfortunate reality of Gaza is that every single item that they procure is procured from Israel, because there's only two entrances into Gaza. Well, there's three. The one is the sea, which is literally blocked off by the Israeli army. The second one is the entry from Israel itself. And the third one is the Rafah border, which is the border with Egypt, which used to have a lot of tunnels under it and where things were coming through those tunnels illegally. But that has now been blocked off. Since the Sisi government took over, they have completely blocked off those tunnels by flooding them out. So those tunnels, and there were hundreds of them, have all been blocked off. So anything that goes into Gaza has to come from Israel. Now, the silly reality is that Israel will come and bomb them to smithereens, and perhaps in this war, yes, there's a political element, but there's an economic side of it as well, because
Sure.
it will help the Israeli economy at the end of the day, because they will bomb them to smithereens, but every single item that's needed to rebuild, from the concrete to whatever else that they need, furniture, infrastructure, every single item will come in from Israel, has to come in from Israel, and has to come in at inflated prices. So the reality is, you come and bomb me, you bomb me completely, but I have no choice but to buy everything from you again to rebuild.
Yeah.
And then a few years later, you come and
You restart
re-bomb
the
me
process.
again, and we start the process again. And you're not selling to me at cost price, you're selling at completely inflated prices, but I have no choice but to keep
And
buying
then
from you.
we've got to remember that there's all the other economic infrastructure that's involved in between. The ports
Absolutely.
that are there, your clearing agents that land your goods, the trucking companies that will move goods from the ports into Gaza, the drivers that are employed in between.
Everything.
All of that
Absolutely everything.
gets added into it. So
I mean, the whole Israeli economy could just work or drive or be enriched by the fact that they're supplying stuff to the Gaza, and also to the lesser extent to the West Bank,
Yeah.
but to Gaza itself. And Gaza is a small area. I think it's 42 kilometers by 7 kilometers. So it's not a big area, but very densely populated area.
Yes.
And every single item, if you take the hospitals that are being bombed, you take the schools that are being bombed, all of that, every single item that's going to have to be bought to restock those hospitals, from all of the equipment, everything will have to be bought from Israel, and at highly inflated
And even,
prices.
like we say, even if it's humanitarianly brought in through an organization like Gift of the Givers, or through a government from like Qatar or Jordan or something like that, it has to pass through Israeli hands first.
Well, there's be a little bit coming through the Rafah border through Egypt, like we're seeing some trucks going through at the moment. But by and large, everything is controlled by the Israelis and comes through Israel. So I mean, it's a crazy situation. If you look at the people of Gaza, they in an absolutely no-win situation economically.
Unfortunately, yeah.
The number in the studio 0861904904. If you want to call our guest Hamza Mahomed, Goolam Mahomed, and speak to him or ask him any questions relating to the economy, and more particularly war and conflict regarding the economy. Or you can WhatsApp us on 060-904-1056. I repeat that, 060-904-1056. If you have any comments on the topic at hand, which we've been discussing for the last 25 minutes, which is the impact of war on the economy. Hamza, before we went to the break, we touched on various aspects of the war, and particularly the conflict in Ukraine and in Gaza now. We have had wars before, starting from, I think wars has been there. We hear of war and conflict from time when time started. And but let's just talk about some of the examples in history of where wars have taken place, the major wars, World War I, World War II. They've concluded. The impact thereafter, what immediately happened thereafter, after these major wars?
So, I think in terms of World War I and World War II, we saw a great drive to rebuild and primarily stabilize nations. And I think that's a key factor in terms of providing stability once the wars are completed. And if you look at examples like the Gaza war right now, one of the key questions that's come up both from the Israeli side and something that the UN and the US are also trying to figure out, if you will, is what happens to leadership afterwards. You take Hamas out of the equation, who do you put back in? Because you're going to have a power vacuum afterwards. And we've seen a nice example to look at here is Somalia. Since they've had conflicts, Somalia is one country on a map, but split into three different governments, if you will. You've got the central government that's AU-backed, that's based in Mogadishu. Then you've got Al-Shabaab that manages the southern half or the southern third of the country. And you've got the northern third of the country that's called Somaliland, that's a semi-autonomous region. And businesses there struggle to redevelop themselves because you're now answering to through three different sets of rules, three different tax collection entities. It's a very it's not an environment that's conducive to rebuilding an economy and to rebuilding the society at large. And going back to World War II, we saw the disparities that came about with the separation of Germany, and till today, I think that's still sometimes evident in parts of Germany, where you've got East Germany that's slightly less developed than West Germany was, and that's primarily due to the types of leadership that Germany came under post World War II, after the war. So, one of the key factors to rebuilding a nation, and one of the long-term effects that comes about is, through the leadership that's absent or present in the nation afterwards.
Okay, I mean, while you're speaking, the other country that comes to mind immediately is Libya, where we find two different governments. Post the conflict, it's just never been the same.
No.
At loggerheads with each another. And again, depending on where more of the international assistance goes through, I'm talking about military assistance, one side will have the upper hand, and then the other side has the upper hand. And one wonders whether they, again, the powers that be, the major powers, again supplying both sides just to keep them fighting, so that the armaments industry can keep rolling on.
And Libya is a very sad example, actually. Gaddafi was not exactly a poster child for the perfect leader, but under his rule, there was near zero homelessness in Libya. Education was freely provided by the government from preschool all the way through to tertiary education. Healthcare was free. Government stipends were being handed out to people. It was a very well run society for the most part. Well,
the people were happy,
and the people were generally happy. I mean, yes, there were parts of society that were definitely under Gaddafi's thumb and suffered under his rule. But for the most part, overall well-being of society was being upkept, and we've seen a dramatic turnaround in that. And like you say, there's depending on your requirements and what suits your national interest, different foreign governments are supporting different factors or factions that are acting in Libya, and for all intents and purposes have split the country in half. And oil revenues are at near zero level. A lot of their foreign currency holdings that they had have been frozen or are blocked and not being released, or released at the mercy of international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, etc. And that makes it very difficult again for the country to rebuild. And every time you need to bomb something, an airport or a power station or a road gets bombed, and that just destroys the infrastructure that helps the economy support itself.
Yeah, unfortunately, the reality of the case. But the very nature of war itself, if you look at it, has changed quite dramatically. In the old days, you used to have face-to-face fighting, and then it became, but there were boots on the ground, so to speak. In nowadays, when a war is fought, it's not about that anymore. It's all about drones, and everything is fought on a very technological kind of way. And I would think the future wars in the world would be about resources. They would be fighting over water, and they'd be fighting over other resources, but water being the main one. So perhaps that would kind of be the trump card in time to come. At the moment, a lot of it is very much fought for oil, and that's the main resource. But that will change when electrification takes place. As we see motor vehicles all moving towards more electrification, the necessity for oil will perhaps drop in times to come, or become less important, and then people will move on, and something else will become more strategic. But let's talk about the long-term economic impacts of war, and what are the economic consequences of conflict on the longer-term basis.
Yeah, so you're talking about resource war. Sorry, just stepping back from the question a little bit. We've already seen shifts in the interest of larger governments away from oil towards the Central African Basin, because it's resource rich in minerals and metals that are needed to support battery production.
Right.
And so that shift has already started. It's already moving away, and maybe to an extent that's also why they're not too interested in wars in the Middle East and supporting those anymore, And the fight
it's
now,
all about lithium now. Yeah.
the new theater of conflict, if you want to call it, or of interest, if you want to call it, is around securing who has access to all of those metals and minerals that will give them power in the battery wars to come, and alongside that, water being there as well. Going on to the question itself and the long-term impacts of war on an economy. Again, you've got a severely diminished workforce already. You've got a lot of refugees that have taken the knowledge that they had and left the country, and then you've got a population of youth generally that have had little access to education or poor quality of education. Healthcare facilities have generally been destroyed, and so then there's no healthcare facilities and disease becomes quite rife. And then water and food security becomes big issues as well, and those are the focus areas then of those youth that grow up post-conflict. And with that, it makes it very difficult to actually rebuild an economy, because your human beings, your workforce at the end of the day, is what does the work. Without them, it's very difficult to actually then rebuild that economy. More on over to a little bit of a macro scale, all of your destroyed infrastructure needs to be rebuilt, and where heavy manufacturing and industry has been affected, all of those goods and services need to then be imported, which puts the country in a negative debt situation, because what income do they have to drive or to pay for those imports?
Yes.
They've got to borrow money for that, and generally borrow that money at very high costs from the IMF, from the World Bank, from a development bank. And those interest repayments then sit with those countries and those governments for years and years and years to come. And so do they ever really get to break out of that trap that they've now been set in? I don't think so.
Yeah, Hamza, we got a few minutes left, so I'm try to round up. But are there specific industries or sectors that are more susceptible to global economic repercussions?
I think we look at maybe Russia or Ukraine to take an example that's very current. And just to keep it short, you've got a severe lack of the ability to generate electricity, and therefore your heavy metal and or mining industries, your heavy energy users generally face the brunt of the force. So your mining, your metal refinement, heavy industry and manufacturing, those are typically the areas that you'd find most affected by conflict and war.
And how do businesses, small and large, adapt to the economic challenges posed by these conflicts?
I think you've got two keywords that you need to apply. One is resilience, and the other one is agility. We saw during COVID how clothing manufacturers switched their business models around to start producing masks and medical gowns and things like that. And they adapted because people weren't going out and shopping for clothes anymore. They were sitting at home. And then even clothing manufacturers that were typically, office wear producing companies transitioned to producing more at the leisure and stuff for people to work from home in. And so agility and resilience in your economy, diversifying your supply base and making sure that you build a company that has those fundamentals in its management structure, in its outlook to the economy is key.
Yeah, people say we sitting here in the southern tip of Africa, and we too far away from the conflict for it to really have any impact on us. But I'm sure we would be impacted in many ways.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, like we said with Russia, Ukraine, we saw a drain on or a blockage through sanctions of Russian energy exports getting into Europe. And that drove a huge amount of demand for local coal exports. And that was the result, or resulted in those lines of trucks that you'd see when you drive towards Richards Bay, standing and waiting to deliver coal to the port, because that coal is all now going into Europe. As much as Europe puts itself out on the map as a clean energy producer and consumer, there's still a huge demand for fossil fuels. And so we were directly impacted, perhaps in a more positive way through that, but also negatively through the increase in costs of wheat and oil and other things, which drove our own supply side inflation that our Reserve Bank is trying to fight at the moment.
Yes, we've seen how our petrol prices and diesel prices have shot up, and hopefully that comes down. I think we are expecting a reduction in price next month, but not enough to mitigate against factors that affected it when it went up. So let's talk about a post-war kind of environment where we, inshallah, hope the situation in Gaza it is a ceasefire very soon, and things settle down, and we can only hope and pray for that. And that and let's talk about a recovery. So what are the key factors that contribute to economic recovery post-conflict?
I think there's still a lot of debate amongst scholars as to what contributes to a strong post-conflict recovery. That being said, ensuring that there's a society has access to healthcare and water, and there's food security, to create a stable society upon which the economy can then be rebuilt, as well as strong institutions, because once you've got a stable citizenry, you give them institutions that keep justice and security around in the economy, and on top of that, then you can start rebuilding a society that's free of the government corruption and the what's the word that I'm looking for? But just corruption and the favoritism that comes and we've seen in countries like Iraq, for example.
Sure.
Where pals are given jobs in government not based on merit but based on who they are.
Right.
And if we look at the example of Japan, where they've got a very strong-minded citizenry, they're a very disciplined type of people societally. Their recovery post World War II, when they were bombed and quite badly damaged by the Americans, has been phenomenal, and they in the top economies of the world today, at the forefront of every kind of technological advancement. But that took a lot of discipline in their rebuilding. Of course, the economy of the world is not the same as it was in World War II,
Sure.
and so maybe some of those what they did needs to be tweaked a little bit. But primarily, I think focusing on securing your citizenship so that you don't have internal conflicts brewing afterwards, and building a strong leadership are key to rebuilding an economy after a conflict.
Excellent, Hamza. I think well answered on that one. Some closing comments from you on the nature of the economies that are infected by war. Inshallah, we all hope people can work together to mitigate these things, but that's asking for the impossible, I would think. Wars are always going to be there, but give us some of your closing comments.
I think, like you say, we all make dua, inshallah, that the world finds peace, because peace gives you the best kind of environment for society to move forward, and for economies to grow, and for general prosperity to come about amongst people. And I think, just as a reminder to ourselves, from Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, we know how Muslims should conduct themselves in conflict, and we saw that when the Hamas military, if you want to call them that, invaded Israel, and from the comments that we've seen from some of the hostages that were released, that they were well treated, etc. And if countries that find themselves in a situation where they must enter into conflict with another country, if they can conduct themselves in a manner that's in line with international conventions, with what Islam teaches us, I think conflict would be less impactful than it is today. I mean, but that's wishing on a unicorn. It really is asking for a lot. So, as a people, I think we need to just do what we can do to support the truth and to support the people as far as we can, buying products, example, from Palestine, or trying to do business with companies in Afghanistan, and not shying away from trying to support those economies and contributing where we can to their rebuilding efforts in a constructive manner through the correct channels.
Inshallah, I mean, Hamza, Goolam, Mahomed, it's been absolutely wonderful chatting to you. All I can say is the forex desk at Al Baraka Bank is in safe and capable hands, and Allah give you much strength and take you from position to position, if I can call it that, at the bank. And wonderful having you in here as well. And inshallah, we'll chat again in the future on some other economic related activity that's taking place in the world, and your input on that as well. But thanks for being here. And with that, it's me signing off. I will not be with you next week. I'm off to China for a few days of work, but the show will keep going on. The show must go on, as they say, and I'll be back with you inshallah in 2 weeks time with another Business Matters program. So with that, it's wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.